Now we're live on YouTube
Okay,
and Twitch. Welcome everyone. This is FlaskCon.
maybe we can start with Mr. Andrew. Greetings, Mr. Andrew, and welcome to the first FlaskCon session.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is great.
Maybe you can we can start by you presenting yourself.
Sure. My name's Andrew Schonfeld. How's everybody doing? Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak. I've been a web developer now. I guess you'd call me full stack. I kind of dabble in everything, but I've been doing it for about 14 years. Started out in Java for about 8 of those years, and ever since been doing Python, Flask applications. Recently during this pandemic, I managed to switch jobs, and now I'm focusing more on TypeScript development at an autonomous vehicle company in Pittsburgh. And it's been a big change. I mean, not to mention everything that's going on in the world, but you know, still been able to work on detail and getting a lot of good responses. And Flask has been a big part of that project. I mean, I've been working on it now for almost a year, and it's gotten a really good response from the data science community, and even some of like the React community, and obviously the Flask community. You guys responded very positively, and it meant a lot to me, because you know, you never know when you put yourself out there. People always say there's trolls out there you got to watch out for, but no, everybody was really positive, and it was very refreshing. You know, this was the first open source project I had ever worked on, and it's been great. It's been great. But circling back to Flask, it never would have been possible without it. I mean, starting off in Java and working with like Spring applications, I can't tell you how many hours I lost trying to debug settings in WebXML and so on and so forth. And within an hour of working with Flask, I was spinning up web apps and APIs and whatnot. It was great. It was just, you know, set it and forget it.
And yes, now can you present detail, like do a presentation of what it is, and feel free to share your screen to maybe it's up to you to present detail in your own way. So feel free.
Sure. Let me, I actually do have a live demo available from the GitHub site. So anybody around is more than welcome to play with it. Perfect. So I'll just maximize this. So this is just, you know, let me just jump right back to the GitHub site really quick. So right on the main page, you'll see this little live demo link. That's all I clicked. And then this is just some housing data that someone gave me who had requested some features a while back. So long story short, I was building this while working at a small hedge fund in Boston. We had been, I don't know, they had been working for like the previous 20 years in a language called SAS, pretty close to like R. And they had a little visualizer for viewing the data sets in SAS that users would kick off from the command line on Linux terminals. And we completed a conversion to Python, and they needed a replacement for this application. And so that's kind of where detail came about. So they needed a way to view their pandas data frames real easily. And so this is what it ends up looking like. Let me see if I can kick off it integrates really nicely into Jupyter notebooks as well. So this is just something that I had. I was working on a feature to allow users to pass X-array data structures into detail. And so there you go. It shows up directly in the Jupyter Hub notebook, just under the hood using an iframe tag. But anyway, going back to the actual app, you can do simple operations like sorting, filtering. Let's just set this to the minimum date. There you go. You see your row and column counts. Your row count goes down because we just filtered to the one date. You can edit in place. So this is a Boolean. Enter. There you go. And there's a whole bunch of other cool features. I mean, it's quickly kind of grown almost in a way to allow people to get like introduced to pandas and do operations that they might not know how to do by writing code yet. So I mean, there's this feature that I've built in, the little code export. So this code right here is all the code that went into bringing up that data frame initially. So, you know, df is just the data frame you passed into detail.show. And these are just some preliminary operations that I do to kind of massage the data so it's going to show up nicely in detail. Over time, I really got into building out chart visualizations in detail as well. Originally, I was building all my own kind of React components off of any open source packages, mainly Chart.js. But eventually, someone turned me on to Plotly Dash, which is kind of their own wrapper on top of Flask to host their Plotly charts. And it's really easy to integrate it into your own Flask applications. And so this is kind of how it works in detail right now. So I'll set the x-axis to the dates, put some prices up. This is going to look a little weird because we haven't aggregated it, but if we take the mean, now you got nice line charts, bar charts, scatters, do word clouds. The word cloud was something that I had to put in myself because Plotly didn't support it, but they make it real easy to build out your own components. And eventually I plan on kind of giving this to them so they can host it on GitHub and other people can download it. Right now, this is just integrated directly into detail. But once again, you have code exports based off the charts that you built. You can split these charts up into pop-ups. That one, for some reason, did not work exactly how it looked over here. A lot of cool features in this. Do you have any questions on things you can do with this, or maybe like the Flask makeup behind it?
Yes, I have some questions. This is David.
David.
Hello. I really like this. I've worked on similar libraries to show data to users quickly. How much of this is front-end sort of interaction? What's happening on the back end versus the front end? So like, are you doing data sorting on the back end, or is it?
So I'm doing the kind of the way that one of the big requirements around this is that when we were working in SAS and viewing SAS data sets, they were able to bring up these gigabyte size data sets, no problem. And so we wanted to give users the sense that they're able to load all of their data at once to the screen. So you load your data frame into detail, it gets stored in the back end in a global object. And so sorting, filtering, things like that you just mentioned, that's all happening on the back end and getting sent back out. But the really nice thing about Flask that going into this, I didn't know you could really do is you can store items on the back end and change them if you spin up your Flask process in a separate thread, and it will get persisted to the Flask process. Like Flask still is communicating with the global objects that were available at the time of starting up that process. So that's why like you can spin up detail in a Jupyter notebook and access the data you passed into it and make changes to it if you do know some other complex functions that aren't hosted in detail, and detail will pick up those changes.
Cool. The next question I was going to ask, but you kind of answered it, was so it sounds like multiple people can interact with the same data set at the same time.
Yeah, yeah, you can share these links to people. I mean, as long as they're up and running. I did add something else so that, you know, if you spin up 5 Flask detail processes and you forget about them, after an hour of inactivity, it'll kill it for you. So that way you don't have all these rogue kind of processes hanging out on your machine. A lot of times they'll just get killed just because you'll shut down your notebook or you'll be using it while debugging or something like that. And obviously once the debugging process is over, or the notebook is closed, the processes go away. But for some, I know sometimes I've left the debugger open for days and forgotten about it.
Don't run in production with the debugger.
Yeah, no, exactly.
I tell it to everybody. But did anybody else have any questions?
Maybe just one question. Can we if we were to do an introduction to, can we call it a GUI for pandas?
So you're asking if you can use detail in production. Are you saying like as a standalone application or adding it to your pre-existing application? Or are you talking about
like instead of you know, there are many there are many tools to visualize pandas. Like they provide a graphical interface. So I was saying like does details can it be used for this as well? Or like,
are you talking about
because I see the, for example, the data option, the filtering, etc. So like to explore a data set instead of maybe a standard pandas data frame. So I was saying like if detail can be used like that, like instead of people sometime just showing, just printing out a pandas data frame. So maybe if they interacted with the detail, so it might be nicer, like you have dates and you can you have a GUI for dates, etc. There was a tool called Bamboo I think.
Yes, yeah.
Which,
I've actually spoken with the creator of it. Nice
yes,
guy.
how does detail compare to Bamboo?
So, well, I mean, the first thing is that Bamboo Lib costs money, but I mean, I think if you're using Kaggle, you can use it for free. Detail's 100% free. It's open source. You can fork it and make any changes you want. But the other thing is Bamboo Lib is really tied to Jupyter notebooks. I believe it's kind of leveraging a lot of the components that Jupyter offers under the hood. Obviously, I haven't dug into their code because it's not open source. But it's a great tool. It is a great tool. But the nice thing about mine is, say you're working on it, you're debugging some code inside like PyCharm or something like that. You can call on detail within your debugger. Just open up the little console tab, import detail, and pass like your data frame that's in your stack right to it, and start viewing it really quickly, just to make sure that everything looks in line with your data. You can't do that with Bamboo Lib, as far as I know. They're strictly tied to using it within notebooks.
Okay, and maybe you have some. Thank you for the overview, and maybe we can conclude with maybe you have some the Flask something to say about the Flask code more.
Oh yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, I was in the process of actually making a little little article on some of the things in Flask that I came across while working on detail. Let me just open up the branch and go to the. So a whole bunch of nice topics. I'll share a link to this. The first one is like, usually when I was working with Flask originally, it was all standalone applications. This was the first one where you can kind of call it from a library function and spin up a process on the fly. And I had never done that before. And so this just gives you a nice little code, a little snippet of code on how to do it. Really, really rough overview. There's a lot more going on in detail, but this is just, you know, in as little lines of code, I can explain how it works. so you can kind of see here, you're just spinning up a separate thread and have the function to call app.run. If you wanted this thing to be a standalone application, you literally just take this off and you're off and running. But then if you're trying to use this from a notebook, you essentially handed over control to the Flask app and you can't really use the notebook anymore. So that's why this is kind of the secret sauce. You know, people probably already know about this, but I know for myself is I had never tried applying it to a Flask application before. And then you can kind of see here this global data object. This is what I was mentioning earlier to David about how you can pass in your data frame and then interact with it from the Jupyter notebook and make changes to it, and the Flask app will still pick up those changes. And you can also add more pieces of data to Flask. So that's kind of the next segment around here. Is that originally the way that detail worked is that every time you called detail.show, it would spin up a brand new Flask process posted on a different port. That quickly became very kind of unwieldy. And I reworked it so that it's only going to open up one process on one port. You can still force it to do multiple ports if you want. I don't know why you would, but now when you call detail.show subsequent times, it will just continue adding data to this global object, which is now a dictionary, and it just assigns a predefined identifier to it. And that predefined identifier gets passed in as a root parameter. And so now you can host multiple pieces of data under the same Flask process. So the more and more of these you add, the more options you have available to you from the different roots. So you pass in your first piece of data, it's going to be coming up as detail main/1. Pass in another piece of data, it'll present you with another URL for detail main/2. And there's also, I mean, right here, there's only one instance. Oh no, there is 4. So this shows you all the different instances that are available, and you can toggle between them all. This is some coronavirus data. Nobody wants to look at that, but so that's kind of how the multiple pieces of data come into play. Obviously, you got to be careful how big your pieces of data are, because if you keep adding more and more and don't clean up the original ones, this could get pretty large, and you can hose your notebook pretty quickly. The other thing is that if you don't want to use these predefined identifiers, you can also assign a name to your process. And essentially, that gives you 2 different ways to hit your pieces of data through detail. You can either hit it using that predefined identifier that I've kind of shown here, or you can hit it using the name that you've assigned, kind of shown here. So both foo and one point to the same piece of data. And the way that I kind of handled that is using this URL value preprocessor that is available on Flask. And so it checks any of the values that have been passed in as parameters to the root. And if it's equal to one of the names that you've set on a piece of data, then it will automatically convert that name to the predefined identifier under the hood. So even though in your browser you're seeing foo in the URL, under the hood it's going to end up pointing to 1. So kind of slick, you know. And then this is just some information on how I set up that kind of reaping that goes on under the hood, where if you haven't done anything to your detail process within over an hour, I mean, you can change that setting to be a longer period of time if you want, but it will end up killing the Flask process. So under the hood, I've, you know, kind of written a wrapper class for Flask and added something that gets called on initialization that starts the Reaper. The Reaper is just a simple timer object. Where did I define that? Did I not show it? Build Reaper. Oh yeah, right here. So this is the timer, and this is where it's setting it to 1 hour. And then if that hour passes, it calls this function here. That this was the toughest part to figure out, is how you can kill a Flask process programmatically. So I save information about where Flask is, like the main URL where your Flask process is running. And it's just going to make a call to requests and call this shutdown URL. So you can see here, I have this shutdown root. And what it does is it checks to see if the workzig shutdown function is available. And if it is, it calls that, and that should shut down your Flask process. If it isn't, it will keep running, but I do kind of have a brute force little sys exit on top of things as well. But I don't think that will kill it if you don't have that worksig shutdown. But anyway, you also want to be able to capture whether people are actually doing things. So you're going to want to restart this Reaper every time someone clicks a button or changes a page or something like that. So what I've done is added the before request decorator. And essentially all it does is it rebuilds the Reaper every single time a request comes into detail. So obviously this doesn't really guard against people just performing back-end operations on detail, but you know, baby steps, baby steps. I also added, you know, an example of how I was able to integrate Dash into detail, but this kind of gives you a nice little overview of how to integrate it into any Flask application you have. So once again, I've written a little wrapper on top of Dash's class, and this is where you can specify some extra information about extra styles or JavaScript packages you have. I'm not showing that here. You can also specify your own kind of base layout, which is just like a Jinja template. But the big piece is this: once you have an application context available in Flask, you can call your Dash class and pass it the Flask app. So anywhere you see app referenced, if you just scroll back up through the article, you'll kind of see I'm referencing this app object. That's the Flask process. And then you just assign a path to where all the Dash routes will be available. And then you can just start adding Dash callbacks. And so there you go. You have Dash at your fingertips, and you can start building charts and things like that. And it's very powerful.
Hey, Andrew.
Yep.
This is David again. We're running out of time. So if you have like one cool feature left you want to talk about, go for it. Otherwise, we'll kind of call it here.
Okay, I'll try and talk very fast. Last night I was working on fixing how you can use detail within Google Colab. Google Colab is a free kind of notebook service, and it's really crazy how I'm kind of doing it. You're evaluating JavaScript functions within Python and using that to build a proxy URL that you can access for detail. That's about it.
Awesome. Yeah.
I'm not running on a lot of sleep.
No, it sounds really cool. This has been a really great demo. Thanks for sharing.
No problem. Happy to do it. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and everybody else, we'll have links to this once we post the video of this interview, and encourage everybody to check it out. Thanks, Andrew.
No problem.